everyone. Welcome back to the Meru Media podcast. This is Mukunda. Today we have the third time repeat guest, Dr. Raj Balkaran. Dr. Balkaran, welcome. How are you?
It is a pleasure to be here, and hopefully, I finally get it right this third time.
I think third time is might be the charm, but we're going to probably have you on for fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever as we go down the line. So it's interesting because like I always hear about you through friends of mine that either through the podcast we listen to, they're like, oh, we wanted to reach out to Dr. Balkaran, and they've reached out to you. A couple of people have done that through time, and it's always like the work you're doing not only as a scholar practitioner but independent scholar, and then also providing life coach or even like wisdom guidance to individuals is been really moving for a lot of people. I think that's so first of all, I think like you've embodied that acharya-ness of the Indian system without the godman guru complex of people like Jay Shakti and things like that. So you're walking that fine line, you're doing it well. So I thank you for that.
No, thank you so much. One of the things I say to my students, my close students, particularly at the Indian Wisdom School, is listen, uh, business casual attire, um, commodification, and 3 Western degrees. This will safeguard me from starting a cult. So we're good.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, at least at some level, right? It's always the
Well,
question is when you get big enough, do you still keep that?
but also, joking, not joking, I also say I'm really glad that in this life, I'm a spiritual teacher, a sadhaka, in the guise of an entrepreneur, because there are plenty
Right.
of businessmen dressed as swamis. so,
Oh yeah.
so I'm
Uh,
doing it a little bit the other way around, but I think it works.
Absolutely. No. It's I mean, the work is good. I mean, it's fantastic because this is like kind of the things I think are really truly missing in people's lives, right? Like, I know there's therapy, and that's one real good aspect of it. But like, I have my own issues with the way the therapy is done. In the sense, it's the idea is to keep you around for as long as you can. You have issues, but like in the English system, and I think the way you do it is like, I'm here when you need me. And if you don't need me, that's even better. Like, come back if you need me, come talk to me. But it's like a way, let me bring this 3,000 years of wisdom and kind of help you out to when you need to have it. And I appreciate that, as opposed to like, people need to seek therapy for sure, but there's too much of this material aspect of the therapization of, I think, the West that I think this your kind of paradigm helps address.
Yeah, I think there are paradigms for a variety of folks, and I think that in my particular case, really and truly, one of my real loves and passions and probably core skills in this life is people. How people
Right.
work, what drives them, how they grow, what they're looking for, what their core blind spots are. And it's just something that was congenital, but I've done tons of work and paid a great deal of attention in this life itself. And so, um, one of the most common unsolicited comments I get from working one on one with people is, wow, we went so much further than I did in therapy a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. And I said, well, the difference is that I'm not bound by a bureaucracy, and I'm not bound by a relatively narrow perspective of what a human is or what a psyche is. So
Mhm.
I could bring into this paradigm all of my intuitive ability, all of what I'm sensing from you. There's so much more there, and thinking about what it means to be human is not new. We fancy ourselves so unique, and of course, we're all unique bundles of conditioning in a time in history and culture that will never again be repeated. But just as all works of art are unique and stemming from one spectra of colors, one palette of colors,
Mhm.
so too, thousands of years ago, in the times of the crafting of the Bhagavad Gita, people were plagued and besieged for thousands of years still since then with the very same pitfalls and issues pertaining to what it means to be human, and how we how we trap and block and sabotage ourselves at every turn. So really, part of why the eloquence and the insight of the Bhagavad Gita is in the middle of a battlefield is is acknowledging or positing or suggesting that this wisdom must be practical. If this is not practical and not to be
Mhm.
embodied and not applicable to day in and day out life, it's intellectual speculation at best. And so these teachings can easily and readily be bridged to be applied to day in and day out life. And you're right. The active ingredient isn't the therapist or the counselor. It's the person. It's the person and what they're seeking. And really, it's your job. As Krishna for Arjuna, it's your job to drive them based on where they want to go in life.
Right, right. And and at the end of the day, it's that line of "Yata ichasi tata kuru," right? Like, I've given you all this, take it and do what you will, right? But this is the interesting thing. It's like, I think so. Similarly, I've started mentoring some young men as cohorts. So a small group of, like, let's say, six of us. And I'm in my 40s. These guys are in their 20s, and whatever. Um, and so there is like this deep crisis, and a lot of people do talk about this in podcasts, and Jordan Peterson. A bunch of people talk about this, like, crisis in masculinity, right? In the sense of, like, a lot of young men are struggling to understand what it means to be a man and how to be a man, in a world that's so, the foundations are kind of being very, very, like, shaky, right? And then so they end up going to people like Andrew Tate or the Fresh and Fits, or these really toxic versions of what masculinity is, and, like, the value systems, like, ulta, it's topsy turvy in the sense of, like, the fundamental for that system is aggression plus wealth and status and material behavior, right? Whereas I think in the dharmic sense, like, it's the other way around, which is there's virtues that we have to follow. Like, let's use example like Ramachandra, right? Ramayana, right? Like, I put the Uttarakhanda aside because I don't think Uttarakhanda is part of the main text, so that's a whole other story. I know. So I treat, like, Rama from Balakanda to the end of Yudhakanda, and the character that he presents there is, to me, like, is such a strong character. Both of, like, not only, like, he is that um ideal Rajarishi in some sense, right? In that king that is both the king, but also the rishi. In the same sense, he also represents, like, this deep sense of what that world sought to be important as masculine. And I think that some of those values brought today, like protection of women, standing up for truth, always, representing, meaning what you say and saying what you mean. And, like, what does he tell to, like, Vibhishana, Sita, whoever seeks refuge in me, no matter who who opposes them, I will stand by your side, right? And this is something, like, where I think that this idea of grifting goes away with this. And I think these ideas have to be cultivated among young men more and more to give them a sense of how to be better in this world and treat people better. It just, so I've been doing that. So that's interesting. I mean, I don't love your thoughts.
Yeah, there's so much there. First and foremost, good for you. Congratulations on sharing what you have with those in need, not akin to feeding the hungry. These young men obviously are drawn to you because they see something in you, whether by virtue of you serving as an exemplar, or perhaps they've heard some insights on the podcast. There are various ways in which we impact people,
Yeah.
whether by example or by exposition or by transmission, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's extremely important. You know, um, Ironically, one of the things I teach a great deal on is the feminine divine and Shakti.
Yeah.
And over the course of teaching about Shakti to men, women alike, what I find myself returning to time and time and time again is archetypal masculine and archetypal feminine,
Mhm.
Shiva and Shakti,
Yeah.
yin and yang, Lakshmi Narayana.
Yeah. Yeah.
You and for folks to really grok, really understand that these two principles far transcend physiology.
Mhm.
They express, these are principles innate to existence, quite literally, not metaphorically, and without whose combination, collaboration, some yoga coming together, life does not emerge in this
Right.
realm,
Right.
corporeal life in flesh. And so, So these principles are most grossly, perhaps pun intended, but in terms of stula, they're more grossly manifest in your prakriti, in your physical body, in terms of the sexes. Now, in all of their wisdom, the developers of the Deva Bhasha of Sanskrit, the language of the gods, so to speak, created three genders. There's masculine,
Right.
feminine, and there's everything else. So
Yeah.
it's been known since ancient times that there's that which is not masculine or feminine, right? So there's insight there, but nevertheless, the masculine and feminine principles operate on the level of physiology, which we can think of crudely as sex,
Mhm.
operate on the level of sociology, which we could think of as roles or gender roles. They operate on the level of psychology, which we could think of as identification, among other principles. But above and beyond all of that, they operate spiritually.
Mhm.
So to adopt the lens and the language of Tantra, there are two channels in the body, the Ida and the Pingala. Okay. And surprise, surprise, the right side of the body is masculine and solar, the left feminine and lunar. And in any iconography, in any crevice of the Indic world, whether it's Shiva and Parvati, whether it's
Mhm.
you'll always see the male deity on the right and the
Beautiful.
female deity on the left.
Yeah.
But the right channel, because of the way the nadi twists and turns, plugs into the left brain, the concrete, analytical, particular mind. And the left lunar channel plugs into the right brain, the creative, expansive, generalizable mind. There's much to be said about right and left brain. Some of it
Right.
can be corroborated scientifically in terms of the actual hemispheres of the brain and what they govern in the body. And some of it is sukshma, well, it's
Mhm.
subtle. And nevertheless, there is a masculine principle and there is a feminine principle, and they're both needed. Most
Absolutely.
men are called, not all, but most men are called to embody the masculine principle. Ideally, if you look at
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
the greats who walk the earth, they're always going to have both very strong. Whether Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Einstein, Da Vinci, or Rabindranath Tagore, any great, they're going to have a very powerful masculine aspect, an ability to assert and to be firm. And they're going to have a very powerful feminine aspect, an ability to accommodate and to yield. They're going to be fire when they need to be fire and water when they need to be water. But men really need to learn the power of masculinity. And the power of masculinity is to be the riverbed, not the river, to be of support to those around you, to be a refuge to those in need, to be a
Right.
pillar of your community, to take responsibility. Yes, this is something that we are all called to do. And in my view, particularly young men are called to embrace the work of masculinity, not at the expense of femininity,
Community. That's right.
but for the sake of and or in tandem with
Mhm.
inner femininity.
Right.
So yes, please go on.
No, no. So that's beautifully said because I think like today we think of like especially in traditional worlds today and worlds we inhabit, like masculinity is seen as sports, aggression, not expressing your emotions, like just being this like semi stoic person, but not really stoic because you're actually frothing inside with rage or pain and whatnot, right? Like there's these expectations um and when again you look back on what you would find within the Hindu framework of like great men, right? Like whether you think about Rama, Krishna, Arjuna, Bhima, they were dancers, they were singers, they hugged each other, they expressed emotions. The emotions you see when you listen to Rama in the forest, a longing for Sita, expressing it to the brother, his creatures, everything. There's the ability to be expressive in emotions has nothing to say or take away from masculinity. Even though it is considered a feminine quality, to be a full complete person, like you have
You
to have
need
both.
both.
Right.
Absolutely, 100%. To be a full living, breathing person. Now, one may be
More one or the other. Yeah. Yeah.
physically one or the other. That
Right.
may or may not map onto their psychology.
Sure.
One might be in a male body, but they have an extremely watery, accommodating psychology. One might
Right.
be in a female body, might have a very fiery, assertive psychology. They may, and any of these people might be stay home. They might have careers, they might have jobs. So the interplay between Shiva and Shakti, or yin and yang, or Ida and Pingala, these two channels, the interplay of these two energies flourishes at various levels, orders of resolution in the life of the individual. But in
Mhm.
either case, they've come into this Janma predisposed towards one
Correct.
at a various order of analysis, and they're very balanced. Much of what's driving the incarnation is bringing themselves into balance. The assertive need to learn to accommodate. The accommodating need to learn to assert. To be a full, living, breathing man is to embrace and celebrate your masculinity,
Right.
elegantly dovetail it with your own femininity.
Mhm.
And the vast majority of men, they need women to teach them the other principle. And the vast majority of women, they need men to teach them the other principle.
Right.
They need only in partnership do they have to figure out the other side of that equation. But an evolved person, like the great paragons of literature and history and religion, whether it's Rama, whether whether whomever, Othello, whatever, the great paragons that we have that we celebrate, they're individuals where you will see lots of both. When teaching about the Devi, and some people are, she's feminine, but she's not feminine. What the Devi is representing, what Adi Shakti is representing, to be the primordial power. She's the power of the feminine and the power of the masculine.
Mhm.
She represents yin yang. So she's gorgeous, resplendent, docile, demure, coquettish at times, but she's battle ready.
Yeah. Yadevi
Weapons and arms.
sarvabhuteshu shakti rupena samsita. Right.
Exactly. Shakti, but what Shakti of all things? The Shakti of masculinity and the Shakti of femininity. So you see her, and sometimes through scholarship, there's a little bit of a fetishization of her Raudra or wrathful aspect, but they
Right.
don't understand the Raudra piece is episodic, folded back into the Saumya piece,
Right.
right? And this glorious oscillation between new and full moon that is the Devi, for her to be supreme, we cannot delimit her power by saying she's just the power of the feminine or just the power
Right.
of the masculine. We say she is the Shakti that all beings use, and she could use whichever side she wishes.
Yeah, this is it dovetails into like Lakshmi Tantra in some sense. Like Lakshmi Tantra talks deeply about the nature of the feminine. Like as Lakshmi is saying in the text itself is Vasudeva Paravasudeva Narayana does nothing. He's just pure consciousness. He sits there and she is the acting. She's the one who actually gives grace. She's the one that makes the world go around. She's the one that empowers all things. In fact, even the four of the vyuhas that come from Paravasudeva are all her itself. In some sense, it's beautifully expressed that way, where that the consciousness is here, the activity is here, and where they meet, this all happens, right?
Shakti is Shiva in motion,
Yeah,
and Shiva is Shakti at rest.
yeah, yeah. That's a good way to
Two
say it.
sides. They're two sides of the same coin. How do you separate the dancer from the dance?
Yeah,
Where's the dancer unless he is dancing? Then you see the dancer through the dance. But can you
that's
separate
absolutely
them?
right. Yeah, in the philosophical sense, you'd say Shiva is being, while Shakti is process. And in this sense, you have to have both of these process theology and being theology in order for things to make sense in this world and exist.
Without the temporal, how
Yeah,
does the eternal have meaning?
right.
Yes.
So it's awesome. I mean, so it's just something I think people need to think about a little bit deeper and look at how to like explore those parts of themselves that they've left lacking and they feel unfulfilled in. And I think a large part of men will find that in they haven't addressed their feminine side as much, and they need
No.
to put energy there.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and women, in some sense, have to also do that too for their own side.
We like all civilizations,
Yeah,
every civilization has a trajectory, has a bias, has blind spots, has values, and Western civilization is no exception.
Right.
And one of the foundational unconscious narratives of Western civilization is what we see in Genesis and Exodus.
Right.
And this is a narrative that majestically glorifies the masculine principle. You cannot get more left brain if you tried. Yahweh has a 7-day planner and plans to rest on the seventh day and creates in an extraordinarily organized manner. And
Right.
so that majestic exaltation of the masculine is at the expense of the feminine, where there is no feminine divine principle, and feminine forms are trouble at every turn, from Eve, who famously and infamously
Right.
was tempted by the serpent, etc. And so unconsciously, our civilization struggles with Shakti, struggles with feminine power or feminine energy or femininity. Um, and that's part of what we need to learn. And I think men that are able to embrace their inner femininity, I mean, various characters, or dozens and dozens of characters from all kinds of, let's use sci fi fantasy, Aragorn.
Yeah.
Aragorn is what? Aragorn is a man's man, but he speaks Elvish. He knows how to heal Frodo with the herbs. He's very much in touch with his emotions. He's a living, breathing, full man. Men who fear their own femininity because they've been indoctrinated in terms of some Shakti Hina psychology of, men who are sort of allergic to
Mhm.
Shakti and can't embrace it in themselves. They're the ones whose power is brittle, and they want
Right.
outer power and they want an outer show. It's all outer for them.
Right.
But the ones who are able to go inner and embrace that aspect of self, they can have power that's innate, intrinsic, not extrinsic.
Right.
Power
Right.
that's yours.
What?
Gandhi's a profound example of that, actually. Gandhi's a profound example. Swaraj, my power is mine, right? From
Right.
that inner self rule, we will mobilize an army. But without that inner self rule, you'll be colonized for the rest of time.
Right. Right. And I think that's the issue in today's dialogue around the masculinity is become its outer show. Like these concepts of high value men being determined by the wealth you have or the vehicles you drive or the kind of women you get. It's very like object oriented, out there, out
Outer,
there.
outer.
Yeah.
But you see, Rama
Yeah.
is perfectly situated. The Sanskrit epics are perfectly situated historically because
Yeah.
they have two parents. They have a Vedic parent
Yeah.
that's all about yajna and blessings, and
Action.
perhaps a
Yeah.
little more, maybe slightly more masculine or virile or
Yeah.
outward. Indra is the poster child of Vedic thought, obviously. And then they have this other parent that is all about the inner, the ascetic, the Shramana traditions that become Upanishadic or Jaina or
Yeah.
Buddhist, you know, these traditions of inner turning. And then Hinduism does this profound move where it integrates ascetic thought, ascetic ideology, and then that gets lusciously worked out in the Sanskrit epics, where Rama behaves as if he has the Bhagavad Gita for breakfast,
Yeah.
where he's stoic, but not in a martyrdom way, not in sort of not in a too cool for school. He's like, no, Lakshmana, chill out. Who can argue with their own destiny? Who can beat their own destiny? This is the hand of fate at work. He's plugged in and he has an intuitive sense. This is the right thing to do, and he's unable to. And Lakshmana is like, the hell's your problem? You're a king, you're a warrior, you're a Kshatriya. If men
Yeah.
like you don't create their destinies, then who among us can? But Rama is connecting with his inner wisdom. He's understanding that this is meant to be for him right now.
Right.
At all costs, he will, even what it costs his mother, his co-mothers, his father, what it costs the citizens. On a prima facie, as somebody who is, a born leader, I'm not sure I would make that decision because of what it would cost society and the suffering it would
Right.
cost, unless I had a higher calling that this needs to be done for a greater purpose. Because it's a very poor decision to make in terms of the welfare of your realm with which you've been entrusted. This is yours. But he's hearkening to the inner seeing power. So one can crudely simplify and think, well, outer for all of us is the masculine mode, inner is the feminine mode. And he's prioritizing that inner seeing and bringing it out outwardly. That's why he's such a paragon.
Yeah. 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 So I mean, I think that's fair, right? Like in the sense of his determination to not let the outer world affect what needs to be done at that point. Is, ultimately he has his desires for his fathers, his mothers, his brothers, his love life in Ayodhya, and he decides it's best for all of us for me to do this. And even if it's going to cause short-term problems, I will deal with it, and I will do what's right. Right. And I think that's where the idea of Dharma plays a role. It's a long-term play. It's always about long term. It's about what brings. It's not who gets satiated now. In Is it better to have that donut now or wait until you've done your workout, whatever it is, and then part of this is that is the undergirding of this. And I think this is where it's actually interesting enough. We can actually jump into a couple of your pieces of work that you've done recently, because it touches right upon this. So recently you released and wrote along with co-authors two interesting articles which I thought were really fascinating, about war, war theory, violence, in both one article on the Puranas, one article on the Itihasas, particularly the Mahabharata. So, can you kind of give us a quick snapshot? Because I don't want to talk about two separately. Let's just kind of integrate them both, if possible, in the conversation. So, if you could talk about what the ideas behind these articles were, and what kind of like got you to write them in the first place.
Well, this is so very relevant to what we were talking about a moment ago, insofar as Rama was so captivating a figure. I took an undergraduate course on Rama with RT Don some over 20 years ago. And his decision to renounce on the day of his coronation, I could feel the text speaking to me and saying something profound, but I didn't quite have the language to articulate it. So it brought me into grad school. At the same time, I happened to meet a man named Walter Dorn. He's the professor at the Royal Military College. He does defense studies, and it's his job to train Canadian Armed Forces in terms of the ethics of violence. When should we pull the trigger and under what conditions? What are the parameters when engaged in combat? And this is something that's on everyone's mind these days. But these questions are not new. And so, what I was able to show through my master's research, taking a very close look at the Valmiki Ramayana that was published at the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, is that all of the modern Western concerns pertaining from a Greco-Roman European trajectory, pertaining to just war and just war criteria, they're all baked into the Valmiki Ramayana through the plot and through the characterization. And what I say to folks at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies is that, narrative does the work of philosophy and theology, but you have to know how to crack the coconut. Sure, you might be thirsty, and who wants the shell of a coconut? But if you can crack that coconut, it's the most enriching, nourishing, delicious hydration you'll ever have. And
Yeah,
it's all there. And so this is something that's been on the back burner, this interest in the ethics of violence, right? The ethics of Kshatriya Dharma versus ahimsa. This tension
yeah,
has very much been of interest to me. And some 10, 12 years later, Walter Dorn approached me and said, look, the International Committee for the Red Cross, they're the body whose job it is to deal with international humanitarian law. That's what they're for. They're looking for voices from other traditions and about about combat ethics and how to behave while you're at war. And so he approached me. He approached me again to say, quite liked your work. I like your writing style, and would you spearhead this project with me in terms of the Indic text? And I thought, sure. So we did a comprehensive look at the Mahabharata. There have been other scholars who have found and pointed to what we found. We looked at the Vedas, Upanishads, various seminal texts. In the second one, it's the first time anyone's comprehensively gone through all of the Mahapuranas, and there's tons of material in the Puranas. The um, uh, insights on the parameters of warfare. And it goes without saying, there's an extremely high bar in terms of how one ought to engage while engaged in armed conflict. And we document all that, and we demonstrate that these conditions are very much alive and well in ancient Indic thought, a la the Puranas and the epics. And moreover, they represent a higher code of conduct, a more stringent, perhaps even more noble code of conduct than even international humanitarian law to this day. And so we found that to be fascinating. I'm not sure if it's just me. Can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect now. Yeah, please,
Oh,
please
sorry.
continue.
Yeah. So I was saying, yeah. So there's a host of questions that are rising from here, and let's start with this one. I think is interesting. Is so this covers a huge swath of time. let's just let's. I mean, if you limit yourself to just the starting with, let's put the Vedas aside, Upanishads aside. Let's just talk about the Itihasas, right? Let's give the conservative date where it roughly runs from 400 BCE to 400 CE, and then the Puranas come, let's say, after that for the next 700 years. We are now covering roughly, I don't know, like 15, 1600 years of human of Hindu thought on this. So did you find in that time in the survey, did you find a like consistency, or did you find a lot of variation depending on what text was and the time period it was written in?
Yeah, so you will find that culture is textured over time, and you will find, for example, in the Mahabharata, various injunctions that are what I think of as idealistic. The epics are idealized in a sense. Okay, you also find um, more realpolitik content in the Arthashastras, and this is sort of something that they temper each other in a sense, where you have an idealized view of warfare and in a more pragmatic realpolitik view of warfare, and I think they're both useful. So certainly you see texts emerging over time. The Puranas are notoriously very, very difficult to pin down, the earliest of which we think, as you say, are probably 3rd century BCE. My suspicion is that I haven't written about this, but my suspicion is that the Markandeya Purana is one of the first, if not the first Mahapurana, just because of how it's framed responding to the Mahabharata. And there are elements of the Puranas that emerge over time, even within a Purana. So these are patchwork texts
Mm-hmm.
that accrue over time. Nevertheless, you don't really see post Mahabharata. You don't really see a dwindling of this high bar. You see a reiteration and a clarification and a coloring of, listen, you need to have your wits about you when you're engaged in armed conflict. You can't go engage someone who's distracted. You can't go and engage somebody who is sick, who is distraught, who is insane. Certainly not the elderly, certainly not children. In this context, certainly not women, etc., etc., etc. So we see this overarching ethos, to my mind, just colored, but we don't see any real deviation in the Puranic context. Much of the content will come from the Agni Purana, actually, but there's lots and lots of snippets throughout the Mahapuranas. But certainly, we would see a very, very different picture in the Upanishads, where it's ahimsa, 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 clearly, right? I hope
Yeah,
that
but
helps answer your question.
it's also interesting there too, because in the Upanishads, I mean, in the
Mhm.
Mahabharata, it's always ahimsa, 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 right? Ahimsa paramo dharma all the time. It's out there, but it's tempered with the violence that occurs, and then you have in the Mahabharata, you have these rules of no high rules, but they get broken in the course of the war. So
Yes,
how
and
does that how do you address that?
well, I think, to my mind, I really truly see the huge swaths of time being the Vedic period and its evolutes, the Upanishadic integration and its evolutes. And I think of these as, what the Mahabharata thinks of as Pravrti Dharma versus Nivriti Dharma. I think of the epics as weaving the Dharmic double helix. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
walking contradiction, because they
Yeah,
have to leverage ahimsa, ahimsa, ahimsa with, you're a warrior. The world needs to be protected. The throne needs to
yeah,
be protected. Citizens need to be protected. And how are they protected? Through violence, because otherwise you yourself will be annihilated. And Um, and I think that is the point. I think the epics need to fully justify violence and legitimize violence, but they also paradoxically have to transmit the wisdom that violence, ahimsa, is the supreme dharma. So they need to be contradictory in the sense of ahimsa is the supreme dharma. So when I looked at the Valmiki Ramayana, the first part of my thesis systematically showed the extent to which violence is fully justified, even through the lens of just war theory.
Yeah.
And that was published in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Now, the second part showed that violence is never fully justified in the Valmiki Ramayana. And from the very beginning, from the birth of verse, where the Adikavi Valmiki curses the hunter for
Mhm.
slaughtering the male of the pair of conchas, wailing in agony, Ma Nishada Pratishta. He wails in response through shloka, born of shoka, grief.
Yeah.
So this cursing, it's a creative act and a destructive act. This
Sure.
cursing of violence.
Great
This is the
beauty.
beach of the Valmiki Ramayana. And the Valmiki Ramayana itself is a curse on violence. And Rama is never happy at Ayodhya. And if we take the banished Uttarakhanda, it to my mind, the separation promised in the bija of the Balakanda through this frame is brought to fruition in the Uttarakhanda, where on some level the Ramayana Ramraja is dystopic, at least for Rama, because Sarvam Dukam, because the world is a mess.
Sure. Sure. I mean, I don't want to get into the Valmiki and Uttarakhanda because at the end of Uttarakhanda, he does say Valmiki does give a Palastuti and says, "Thus ends the Ramayana," and then you have the Uttarakhanda. But that's a whole other story. Um, but no, I mean, interesting enough. I mean, I think these are important points for when we talk about war and in the sense of it's not just between warriors, right? This is also principles that apply to any sort of violence. So how would you just take it from this idea of this kernel, this particular situation of war, to this idea of violence on the whole?
We are in the world. Okay. The wisdom of the ascetics is profound and applicable, but we are not ascetics. So, to my mind, one of the central mandates of the Bhagavad Gita is to say, look, Arjuna, this whole begging bowl idea you have, this is, pardon my French, BS.
Yeah,
You speak wise words, but really you're talking like, the various YouTube talking heads who speak wise words, but they're not wise. If you look at their body
yeah.
language, if you look at their eyes, if you look at their prana, if you have the eyes to see, they're just speaking wise words, but they're really,
Pragnavadam Stabase.
yeah, they're really just, they're just talking heads, man. So get a grip. You're not wise because you're knocking, your knees are knocking, and so leverage the power of this idealism for the sake of pragmatic application. And pragmatism will always compromise idealism,
Right.
but we need an idealist drive for it. So without the North Star of ahimsa, right, we might be inclined to run amok. But it's something asymptotic where we're approaching ahimsa. We may never fully embody ahimsa, but at the same time, how much harm can we minimize? Is it such that all of the harm that we issue is justified and necessary, right?
Right.
Versus wanton and selfish and unthinking. And isn't this the question that's on everyone's mind? Is it justified? What's justified, right?
Yeah. So in this context, so you cover things like the fair fight, which is only equal combatants of equal status. Status here meaning like you're a chariot warrior, he's a chariot warrior, you're armed, and then you fight each other, and then that's fair. You should not be fighting someone that is a horse warrior, you're a chariot warrior. It's just unfair or whatnot. Now, when it comes to how does that play in the modern sense, right? Like now we have today, this day, not chariot warriors, you have machine gun guys versus drone guy. And how would
Well,
we think
should
about this?
you? Well, it seems to be that the application of these texts is fairly instinctive in that if we have tanks, do we pummel people without tanks? If we have bombs, do we bomb people without bombs? If we have, so the idea of fair fighter being on equal footing, what that does is this ancient ethos, self-evident to the wise, but maybe not
Mhm.
self-evident to most of we mortals, is safeguarding against precisely what happens when there isn't fair footing. There's exploitation, right? There's undue
Yeah,
advantage, right? Clearly.
sure. So the question, I mean, but then like here's the thing, it's like when we think about like say it's a just war in some sense, right? Like we had in just an example Hiroshima, Nagasaki in America. The idea would dropping of the bomb would prevent the loss of way more lives. So this one horrible, terrible act of absurd technological power over not stops this. How do we think about that then?
Well, this is going to be a question, and going to be a question that only an ideologue or a fool will have a simple answer to.
Yeah,
This is the question that will necessarily require deliberation and contemplation. Is it
right.
justified or not? Gandhi would say no. I'm sure many others would say yes, absolutely. So, this is a question that we need to wrestle with. This is not a question that'll be easily resolved. Why? Look at the colossal cost. So, for anybody who cares about human
Yeah,
life, this is not something where check, check, yeah, this is right, check, check, nope, this is wrong, because on either side of the deliberation is the colossal loss of human life. On either
right.
side of the deliberation.
Yeah, and with that, it's like I mean, the parallel in the in the myths, I mean, the epics is the divyastras, right? Their ability to cause so much damage and destruction, and their limitation again is about who you can use it against and how you can use it. And but but here's the other question: is like modern warfare is different from going into a battlefield where your opponent's on the other side and you're here. Modern warfare is I'm destroying your city, I'm attacking. So how again in a textual tradition that didn't necessarily talk about like assailing cities and destroying cities and these kind of warfare, how do we think about that today? I mean, isn't the very concept of war today then becoming something that is so degraded in that sense?
So millions of Hindus or those from an Indic background probably visit a Jyotishi at some point,
Yeah.
either cast at birth or upon marriage, or perhaps they have a court Jyotishi.
Mhm.
And the Jyotishi may look at their chart, their Jataka, their birth chart. And the Jyotishi may have predictions about vehicles, vahanas, vehicles. You know, sir, yeah, yes, yeah, you will have SUVs, no problem. I could see it in your chart. No, the principles revealed that the Jyotishi is using, they're at very least 1500 years old, long before.
Yeah.
What they're doing is they're taking principles accorded to the fourth bhava, the fourth house, that pertains to conveyances of all kind in perpetuity for that native,
Yeah.
and they're applying it. And so, similarly, one can take the principles and the ethos and the values of fair fighting and equal footing and extend it. Are
Okay.
these two parties on equal footing? That may not literally mean footing if you are not a foot soldier, but certainly the sense of fair fighting is not culturally derived. It's innate, isn't it?
Sure. Sure. But I mean, but what that means again is like different, right? Like, is it, an example, you Russia, Ukraine, is it a fair fight? I mean, these are questions I don't know. Like, is it determined by the skill set of the warriors or the number of warriors or the technology or again the location of the war? All those things that change, right? Like you can even look at Gaza and Israel and what happens after October 7th. Is the response fair? Is it an issue of Islam versus Judaism, and is Israel looking to survive its own like destruction in this? I don't know. And these are the questions that like, do we have different responses to that?
Indeed, you don't know, and no one knows. And yet, there's much to be said with respect to these situations being complex and multi perspectival.
Right, but at
Um,
the same point, there has to be decisions people make, and that something has to
and
be a little more right than not.
the decisions that people make, yeah, the second point I was going to make is however messy the situations are, they're not as messy when people and peoples have moral teachings to fall back
Yeah.
on, have principles and precedents and examples. And so part of what we can see from the various worlds traditions, in this case from the Hindu tradition, is an ethos of scrupulous care when engaging civilians, for example, right? Civilians should
Yeah.
never be engaged. So this is something that we can perhaps apply, whether it's Russia, whether it's Israel, whether it's who knows where. This is of use. So certainly, I think part of the issue is whether or not the decision makers are concerned with ethics anywhere,
Right.
right?
And the question arises is, like you said earlier, one of the rules of war, or at least I think it was in the writing, if your opponent uses unfair means and deception, then you are allowed to too. So then it's like at that point, it's like if you start the race to the bottom, there will be a race to the bottom, right? At some level.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one set of teachings and one possible. There are a number of competing factors here, but I think that first and foremost, all of the teachings and all of the actions are filtered by individuals, and most pressingly, individuals in charge.
Mhm.
And why we see the example of kings who have to end up going into forest exile for some boot camp. There were no online schools then, unfortunately, so they had to go into the forest. Why does this happen? Education, training, and leaders particularly need to have some inwardness, need to have a north star or two in terms of ethics. And I think that none of the deliberations have legs, have the potential for traction, lest they be entertained by the people in charge,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, but the thing is, like, I have to think is we have rules of just war. We have rules of a Dharmayuddha. And again, Dharmayuddha, as you guys made very clear, is not simply about like a religious war. This is really clearly based upon if you haven't done the four, it's the last of the four measures, right? Sama, Dana, Beda, and then Danda is right? So Sama is a reconciliation. Beda is dissension. Samadhana Dana is like giving money, bribing, whatever you want to say. And then the final is like war, right? Danda is force. So if the first three were done, like Udyoga Parva and Mahabharata is all about Pandavas taking every effort to avoid this war at almost at all costs. Now, in today's world, is diplomacy is being done in states and countries all the time, back channels, everything that's happening, right? And these principles, I think, at some level, are applying today too. But we end up in situations where once you get to war, the simple idea is you just win the war, right? Is that something that would be seen as even considered to be dharmic in that sense? Because you win the war, you can address the problems that occur.
Well, I think certainly much of the literature that we find, many of the teachings that we find, suggest that it's not as simple as the end justifies the means. The means is very important because these principles come from within the overarching scaffolding of karmic theory.
Right.
And the actions in and of themselves will create reverberations and consequences. And so it's not such that through this lens, for those who are thinking along these lines, concerned with ethics, concerned with metaphysics, to my estimation, very few world leaders, if any, are. But this is why we see these quote unquote leaders, these kings, being trained in spirituality and philosophy, because it renders their actions and their decisions morally and spiritually potent or consequential. So it's
Sure.
not just about the ends, it's about each act undertaken en route to the end.
Right, but I mean, but that's I mean, so and there you have the flip side, something like Cotilia, who takes a much realist position, right? The duty of the king is to protect his empire through any means necessary, which means even if you have to fight unfairly, you do so. So how would you juxtapose that with like because although we claimed Cotilia as secular literature, I think it's part of the tradition of Raja Dharma, Rajaniti, whatever you want to call it.
Well,
Yeah,
certainly, to my mind, ancient India would be no exception
right.
to the fact that the vast majority of these decisions have been taken by insecure men who clamber to the top of the pyramid scheme known as society, and they'll
Sure.
do whatever they need to do to maintain their position.
Right, right, right. Okay.
And this isn't new.
Good.
This isn't new. But
So
what the epics do, what the dharma of the epics is, on some level, is to posit ideals. Now, absent those ideals, where would we be? Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's a good point. Now what will you make you said earlier that the you find within the Hindu tradition ideas that go beyond like modern human rights when it comes to just war theory or uh, violence. Well, what are those areas, and where do you think the the epics and Puranas actually maybe are not as good as modern world?
So, in terms of the first study on just war theory in general, that includes deliberations leading up to war. So jus ad bellum, it's called in
Hmm.
the traditional, and then part of that is code of conduct while engaged in battle, jus in bellum. Now, these two papers you are referring to, they were specifically commissioned by the International Committee for the Red Cross, who are concerned with combat ethics. Once we've already gone to war, how do we conduct warfare, if there's such a thing, if it's not a walking contradiction?
Right, right,
What are the limits of warfare? What is a righteous? What is moral? How do we engage in combat in a way that's not wanton or unduly cruel or bloody or
right.
pernicious or vindictive? And so, yeah, it was mentioned in passing earlier that, for example, a combatant on the ground is prohibited from engaging civilians. That's something that is shared by international humanitarian law. Okay. The articles mark, typically in the footnotes, where there are corresponding injunctions in
Hmm.
international humanitarian law, and certain situations where this goes above and beyond. So, for example, um, what we see in the Puranas and the epics is prohibition from engaging individuals who are sick, who are distraught, who are disheveled, right? Because they're not of the right mind. These are
Hmm.
people who need to be protected rather than be destroyed, right? For
Right.
example.
Well, that's interesting. That's very interesting. And what do you think? Like, did you get a sense of an area that the tradition was not as strong as like modern law?
I think the tradition is possesses a great deal of idealism insofar as it goes above and beyond what is expected. Now one can easily make the argument, well, these are ideals.
Sure.
These are the epics. This isn't pragmatic. This isn't historical. One can make the argument that these are ideals and they're not
Right.
pragmatic or applicable, and certainly one is welcome to make that argument. I don't get the sense that there is a shortfall of consideration only a surplus. And I think that really very much is owing to the unique synergy of Indian religions
Right.
having to incorporate ahimsa as a paramount virtue, right?
Okay.
Because of that unique trajectory in Indic thought,
Right.
um, there's far more consciousness and squeamishness about the bloody enterprise of war.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is like I thought I've been thinking about the concept of ahimsa, even the idea of even when you're doing violence, try to do as minimal violence as you can, right? It's, if you have to kill someone, don't prolong it, do it quickly. Avoid the cruelty or anirsham shaya too. That's another concept, right? So the non-cruelty aspect of it, which I think is interesting. And it's a good demarcation between simply just non-violence and non-cruelty.
Absolutely. I would agree.
Yeah. So okay, I want to kind of jump kind of tactics because recently you also came out with another book. What was your book on?
I did. Let me look at my own website to remember. No, there's there's I think I know the one you mean, but there were two that came out recently. One actually is a scholarly work that I co-edited. It's a landmark volume for those who study Sanskrit narrative. It combined 18 fine figures in the field, some of them who've been working on Sanskrit narrative for 30 years, some of them who are more recently minted as PhDs. It's called Visions and Revisions in Sanskrit Narrative Studies in the
You did
Indian
that with
Epics and
McComas Taylor,
Puranas
right?
with McComas Taylor. And what I will say is just that's available for open access download. You could just well, go anywhere, Google it, or go to rajbalkaran.com scholarship. And I may or may not have broken rules. If I did, Shamyata may be forgiven. But you could also get those articles we're talking about. Consider me a scholarly Robin Hood. It's
Yes.
yours. But I think that the book that Mukunda is referring to came out not too long ago. It's called "The Stories Behind the Poses," and it's not a misnomer. It is a work that connects or shows the connections between asanas, yoga postures. In the West, yoga is postures. So when I talk about yoga as a darshana, a path of spiritual evolution, to my students, I say capital Y yoga, because now
Right.
yoga just means posture. So the connection between yoga postures and beautiful ancient stories from the epics and the Puranas. And I mean, in some cases, they're quite obvious where, yeah, you have a posture called Anantasana. Well, if it isn't related to Ananta, and you don't know that Ananta is Vishnu's couch, and there's glorious, profound symbolism about what that couch is in between ages, there's a namesake. So obviously, the mythic motif is directly applicable. If you have a posture called Vishwamitrasana, right, or Durvasasana, Durvasasana is better. You will not be a happy camper doing Durvasasana. It's very difficult and very
You'll be
irritating, and
enraged.
yeah, you'll be irascible, just like its namesake. Sometimes they're very, very obvious the ways in which which story to present. And sometimes it's not as obvious, where Hanumanasana, often called either lunge or monkey pose in English. Well, Hanumanasana. Well, what on earth is Hanumanasana? Hanumanasana is the lunge pose. It's the posture adopted by Hanuman as he took a flying leap
Leap.
over the ocean to land on Lanka to find Sita. And so the posture being embodied, it's really a bhavana being embodied
Huh.
that the posture is helping you to arrive at, and the story will only help you to gain clarity on what is being embodied in that asana.
Now, did you get into at all like, so what's his name? I think is it Mark Nicholson and the yoga guys. I forget. No, I forget their books where they talk about the postures being taken from the asanas being taken from calisthenics or so on. I
Roots of yoga, probably.
Yeah, roots yoga. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay, yes.
Did you have a sense like, so these asanas that were in the book? Did you find them in older texts, or they just like the names you just give stories for?
Yeah, so that's a great distinction. So what I do as a scholar of Sanskrit narrative is make sense of the narrative in a synchronic sense. History is obviously clearly the world behind the text, and the historical process is invaluable.
Hmm.
But really, my penchant and my MO is to look at the themes within the text. So there's a lot to be said about the history of yoga or the non-history of yoga
Right.
or the recent history of yoga. And these are important questions. What I'm doing in this work, particularly as far as it's a public book, is showing the connections between the postures and the narratives
Hmm.
without commenting on the antiquity of
Right.
the postures.
Right.
Um, because it wasn't necessary, whether someone came up with Durvasasana last Tuesday or
That's right.
centuries or millennia ago. Either way, there's no disagreement across the subcontinent in terms of what that posture is called. And it's, imagine if in an alternate universe, think multiverse, alternate universe, asanas came out of an Abrahamic context.
Yeah.
And there's a pose called Moses asana, where his arms are widespread, right?
Yeah.
And what on earth does that mean? And maybe it pertains to him parting the Red Sea, right? And without, irrespective of whether there was an historical Moses or whether Moses, whether the asana came up, 2 weeks ago or 2 millennia ago, the asanas pertaining to a pivotal moment in the journey of Moses. It's
Mm.
embodying that. And so certainly knowledge of Moses parting the Red Sea might facilitate embodying Moses asana. And so that process is a process, that's a process of the experiential, of the moment.
Right.
That's not a process of the historical.
Yeah. I think that's a good point. Because a lot of times I think people get too caught up in this idea that ancient equals true and better, right? Where it simply is like, even if Patanjali Yoga Sutra came today, does it take away from the fact that there's truths in it that pertain to the nature of the mind and the nature of the self and so on? I mean, so I think that's some things that people need to get away from thinking about like ancient equals better.
Old is gold. Not
Yeah,
necessarily.
yeah. Yeah, that's right. It doesn't matter. The Yoga Vashishta was written in 11th century versus, uh, you know, first century, whatever. Oh, I think these are all like pointless. I mean, they're not pointless, but they're not necessary for the truth.
Especially with respect, I think that's part of a Western inflection and influence, especially with
Yeah,
respect to a tradition that does not have a closed revelation by any stretch of the imagination,
right.
where embodiers of the divine return time and time again, of which there are no shortage on the planet right now, from whose lips emerge profundity and insight and
Yeah,
exegesis of the Shastras, in a way that only an awakened person could, right? And it's evident by their presence and their contribution. And so, really, it's crucial. Sometimes people will ask, where's that story from? I'll tell a tale
yeah.
the way that I heard it or with a particular twist. Where's that from? And I'll say cheekily, the text is on the tongue. This is an oral tradition. This is from
Right,
Sampradaya.
right.
It's from Parampara. This is living. You've just basked in the glory of living lineage, and you want to collapse it into a footnote
Right,
because of your idea of what knowledge is.
but that's also the critical edition project, isn't it? It's to
It
say
is.
what is this ur text, this text as far as we can go back to the original of the originals that we have, is this like sense of the critical edition,
Well,
right? And does that even serve
exactly.
that purpose?
Well, the critical edition, there's much to be said for it. There's much to be said against it.
Right.
Um, Ludo Richer wrote a very, very important work codifying and commenting on the Puranas. It's a 1984 work. And one of
Yes.
the most insightful things he says is, look, I too have been trained in European philology.
Yeah.
He values it. And he goes, I'm sorry to tell you, folks, but the Puranas are not amenable to that methodology. They're not
Right.
because the fluidity is not a bug; it's a feature. The
Right.
Puranas are a fluid class of texts. So yes, that approach will perhaps work in certain contexts and not when I am critical of a philological or an historical methodology in favor of a literary lens, as I put it. I just mean it as a corrective. Obviously,
Right. Right.
philology
Right.
is extremely important, and historicism is extremely clearly. I'm just saying. Look, let's just before you slice and dice a text, please pay attention to it because it has
Right.
something to say. It has
That's
something to
fair.
say as is. Then slice and dice and do what you need to do. We can have those quibbles within the realm of scholarship, but in the moment of being transmitted a story in a spiritual context that has just
Right.
blown your mind open, where that's from is not the most fruitful question to ask.
That's true. That's true. I think
in
sometimes
that
I even get caught up.
context in that context, what does this mean? Say more about that.
Yeah.
What so it's there's a time for music history, but
Right.
that's not when at the symphony.
Right. No, and that's fair. And that's fair. So I'm reading Ludo Rucha right now on his Dharma Shastras, which I find to be utterly fascinating.
Really,
And so it's very
you
interesting.
really are a nerd. I'm gonna say, I'm gonna out
Yeah,
you.
yeah. I'm reading that along
You're a
with
total
reading
nerd.
Prabhak. Yeah, I'm reading that along with Prabhakara Mishra's a commentary on Mimamsa. So it's just interesting because it's like it's giving me thoughts about like how they think about the world and how these people thought about the world. It's very fascinating. But
Well,
nonetheless,
if you're lucky, I'll tell you a story at some point. You never know.
I've been told I'm lucky, so I think I'll hear it soon. But what's interesting is like I feel like this is the nature of a lot of just Indian texts and Indian stories. It's like this, whether it's any form, like maybe except for the Vedas, who are like codified and kind of fixed into its own category, but like the Tantras, the Agamas, the Itihasas, the Puranas, the Dharma Shastras, they're all amenable to the exact same issue of their. It's a feature, not the bug, that these things iterate on each other and build.
Mukunda, the very notion of text and
Yeah,
textuality is a projection of modernity, and in particular, modernity that stems from a Judeo Christian and especially
right,
Protestant lens.
right.
So the Mahabharata wasn't written down. You want to study the Mahabharata, you went to one in whom the Mahabharata resided, or
Yeah, yeah,
vignettes there. You want to study the Yoga Sutras, you approach one who has the Yoga Sutras internalized and activated, and they will teach you Atha Yoga Anushasanam, and they'll spend a day or 14
right,
expounding what does that Atha mean and why is it
right.
important. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, tada drashtu sarupe vastanam. And then the seer abides in his own state. Swamiji, what do you mean seer? Who is seeing what? Well, this is the one who is seeing without seeing.
Yeah. What does
What do
that
you mean
mean? And
by
then,
that?
yeah,
This is
it's just
so
a rabbit hole.
and so but after 100 hours of exposition, you have a direct experience of tada drashtu sarupe vastanam. And
Yeah,
so the text is akin to sheet music. It's a prop for performance, but by performance, I mean the alchemy of lived parampara.
right,
This
right,
is the sampradaya. The greatest gift
right.
is the lived embodiment and the facilitation of the embodiment of what this is referring to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, this idea of the text qua the text is a very like absurd idea in the Indian mind, in the Hindu framework,
It's not.
right?
It. All it is a recipe. You don't want to
Right,
taste, or do you want to be a
right,
nutritionist? No problem. Be a nutritionist, but use the recipe for more than. Oh, when was this recipe created? Oh, which court was this recipe created at? That's all important. But do you not want to taste any of this? So there's
right.
this consideration.
No, no, but that's fair. I mean, that's actually a very good point, and just the lived practice and understanding of not the text, but these people that spoke it, the knowledge and experience that sat with the person. Like you just can't get again. That's why Upanishads are so important. Like Upanishad, right? Like, to sit next to and learn, because reading it from a book is not going to give you truth. But sitting there, learning, experiencing, having all your senses involved in this changes you.
And that's why within the textual confines, within the story world itself of every Itihasa Purana, teachings don't come ex nihilo.
No,
Teachings come so and so uvacha. There's always a
yeah,
prashna.
uvacha, yeah,
Within the text itself, they're
yeah,
pointing to the exegesis within the context of sampradaya, right? They're
right.
pointing to within the text itself, they're telling you someone has to come along and ask a question, and then that person will answer the question.
But that's also the reason why you have, like, within these texts, palastutis and these various things, because the idea is you, as you read the text or part, become part of the text, right? The text and you have like almost no separation. This becomes the living experiential nature. And by text, I don't mean like, a book, but I mean is like the chanting, the entire feature of that is part of you.
When someone is speaking and the knowledge, the wisdom, the insight is embodied, it's a radically different experience.
Oh yeah,
And it's palpable to the listener.
right.
It's palpable to the listener when the person is speaking about something they know in that sense versus something they know in this
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah. And I think that's where, like, it's funny because, like, I get, I listen to a few podcasts while I work out and stuff, and some of this stuff is like what I hear when Western philosophy starts talking about like consciousness, but they still use consciousness as mind, and I'm utterly, it strikes me as ridiculously funny to me because I'm like, half the problems you're talking about, these guys kind of addressed a long time ago. They're talking about something else entirely. This the sense of consciousness is not the mind. And the problems with the mind that you're finding about the mind body duality does not exist in the Hindu Buddhist tradition. They're talking about something else entirely. And now you're starting to see a lot of scholars that are engaging with the consciousness world slowly moving towards this positive new theories on consciousness, which to me just seems like old that came out in like in Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism.
Well, these traditions, without question, are steeped in contemplating and engaging in experiencing states of consciousness.
Yeah,
This is what they've been doing. This is what they've been mapping.
right.
This is what we find residually in the texts we honor is their insights about experiences and pathways to experiences of chitta. So
Yeah,
of course, obviously, the modern West is a 16-year-old kid fancying itself brilliant and not paying attention to the old people because they still think the old people have nothing to offer. And they'll get to a certain age where they're like, oh, you were once young too. Okay, how did you manage this? But they have to
right.
mature past the 16-year-old consciousness.
I think that's fair. I do want to ask you this other question before we move on from the yoga topic from the book. I know you traveled around with people doing presentations of the book, part of yoga classes. How did people accept that, and what did you see any sort of tangible difference from when they before the book and then after? Like, yeah, it'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, so the book, there's been lots of interest in the book. There have been people who've reached out for contributions to yoga teacher training programs, workshops, mostly on Zoom. But one of the things I really love to do is to hold space in person for people. So I run retreats typically in beautiful settings in lovely accommodations where folks come in and they're almost always or always I should say on the same channel frequency as people, so they really get on. And then what I like to do is hit it from all angles: intellectual, emotional, spiritual, social. So we have, I dovetail storytelling, group discussion, lecture, Sanskrit chanting, Vedic ritual. And folks really and truly, by their own declarations, they leave changed. They leave not the same people.
Mhm.
There's a massive infusion of insight, of energy, and those retreats have been really I quite love. I think to my mind, they really they they complement the online. They really fill out and complete the online school, because the online school, I'm surprised the extent to which people can be transformed and impacted by online transmissions. But then the in-person retreats, fill it out. So if someone does want in-person instruction, transmission, interaction, I try to make those available to people.
Excellent. So what else are you working on
What am I working on? I don't know. I've got
now?
a new translation of the Devi Mahatmya that's on my desk. The scholarship, blah blah blah. What am I working on?
Is that done?
There's a
The new translation?
It's done, but it's been sitting there because then I have to like carve out some time to get all nerdy with the Sanskrit and just double check everything. But it's done, and it's fluid. It's written in a sort of it's fluid. It's a fluid. It's faithful, but it's fluid.
Are,
And
are
that
you
was
are
kind
you
of the
writing it
point.
for scholars, or are you writing it for like practitioners that want to
I'm
like live
writing
it?
it for anyone who wants to learn the Devi Mahatmya in beautiful, poetic, accessible English. So with an eye or an ear to rhythm and pitch and cadence in English, who want beautiful language along with the content of the glories of the Devi, and so that's sort of
Would you
the
be willing to
scholarship.
share a small little snippet of what you write? If you don't want to, you don't have to.
I don't mind. I'd have to dig it up while I'm talking to you, and maybe you can cut out the pause that I'll need. But here's the translation. There's always some scholarly projects. I'm kind of dipping into the Mahabharata. There's an article on the Mahabharata I'm working on. I have a retreat in June. I mean, in Toronto. I have one in Switzerland and the UK coming up. So retreats. Oh, I started a podcast. I have this, as you
Yes.
well know, this nerdy podcast where I interview authors on their books. But every once in a while I get these emails saying, "Gee, I wish I could hear more from you, or more like, you." I'm like, listen, the podcast is about their book. What do you My job is to let them talk. So I started this other podcast called the Indian Wisdom Podcast, indianwisdompodcast.com, I think. Or just go to rajbalkaran.com. You can get everything you possibly want there. No, I think it's indianwisdompodcast.com, but I don't remember these things. But or just go to Apple or whatever, Spotify.
Yeah.
Um, and so
I'll
every
post in
week,
the show notes, guys. Don't worry
okay,
about it.
great, perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
Every week there's a wisdom transmission. Every week there's a wisdom transmission that sort of speaks to emotional truths and spiritual truths and lived experience. And I always draw some storytelling. So I tell a tale or two and exposit it.
Mhm.
And that's kind of, I think that's it. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm in the podcast, scholarship retreats. Oh, and you mentioned this at the outset. I work with a lot of people one on one for
Yeah.
spiritual nourishment, life direction, life guidance. Yeah, I think I could probably share a bit of the translation for you at some point here. Why not? Um, but you have to ask another question so I can
So you can
stall.
find it.
So I
Okay, okay, okay,
can
yeah. No, I mean, so how do how would people reach out to you for the coaching, the help, in whatever they're looking to do?
Yeah, if you go to rajbalkaran.com, you just click on life guidance. You're more than welcome to book a discovery call, because then entirely free of charge, because then we can make sure that it's something that I'm well equipped to help with, and the timing works for us, and we're that you're comfortable, and I'm it, it's important that your needs are met in terms of where you're at, emotionally and spiritually in its right paradigm. So that's the best way to do that.
And are you also teaching at Oxford study?
Yes, yes, I teach continuing studies. I teach continuing studies at the OCHS, at the Indian Wisdom School, and also at Yogic Studies.
Okay.
What I will do is, read you a little bit of the Devi Mahatmya. So, in the central episode of the Devi Mahatmya, it's the famous Mahishasura Mardani. So the Devi slays Mahisha, and this isn't exactly only an ancient problem when you have some bullheaded demon who steals the throne, and it's more than just waiting 4 years, right? Like they
Yeah.
could be there for 4,000 years. We need to get rid of them. So um, the gods collectively, through their collective tejas, they come together. Through their rage, their outrage, through
Yeah.
their collective outrage, the glorious goddess is born, and she does battle with the buffalo demon, and of course, she reigns supreme, right? And then they thank her. They it's called the Shakradi Stuti. It's probably some of the most beautiful Sanskrit in the text, where Shakra or Indra, king of the gods, they raise their voices in glorious praise. So let me maybe share a little bit of that. When the Devi struck down the vile and valiant Mahisha, along with his army of the enemies of the gods, Shakra, Indra, and the multitude of immortals raised their voices in glorious praise. With heads and shoulders in reverence bent, their bodies made beautiful by rapturous thrill. We bow down in devotion to the Devi who unfurled this world through her innate power, who embodies the powers of all the gods. We bow down in devotion to the Mother, worthy of worship by seers and gods alike. May she bestow blessings upon us. May she have matchless majesty, beyond description, even from Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the fierce one, Chandi. May she set her intent towards the protection of the worlds and the destruction of fearsome misfortune. We bow down before you, Devi, who abide as good fortune within the virtuous, who abide as misfortune within the wicked, who abide as intelligence, faith, and modesty in the hearts of the wise, the good, and high-born souls. How can we describe you, this unfathomable form of yours, Devi, or your invincible demon-crushing might, or your deeds in battle among the throngs of demons and gods? I'll just read another couplet because it's a
That's
beautiful
great.
couplet.
Sounds
I'll just
fantastic.
read just one more couplet,
Sure,
and then
sure.
just because it's this ambivalence of the Devi that's so important. Slightly smiling, your face is pleasing as a splendor of the finest gold, as spotless as the full moon's orb. How wondrous that Mahisha suddenly struck it, his anger aroused at first sight. More wondrous still, Devi, is that Mahisha, beholding your wrathful face with knitted brow, red in hue like the rising moon, did not give up his life at once. For who can live, having beheld the enraged face of death?
Wow, that's nice. It's very nice. It's very nice, Raj. I like it. So,
Thank you.
when do you think that's going to come out?
I need to carve out some time and get over myself and stop panicking about the grammar the grammar police who are going to say you took this liberty and you did this, and the whole I'm being purposefully lucid. It's faithful, but it's lucid, and I think part of my anxiety unconsciously is critique from the people who are stringent about grammar, but I have to get over myself and get it out there. So I hereby pledge that this will be off my desk by the end of 2024. Tatastu Swaha. Amen.
Very good. Very good. Well, Raj, it was awesome. It was great talking to you. Do you have anything else you want to say before we close this out?
No, nothing other than how thankful I am for folks like you who are open to samvada, to dialogue, because
Oh, yeah.
samvada dialogue is not just a it's not just a theological concept in the bowels of Indic texts. Where are we without these conversations? So thank you very much for the opportunity to be in dialogue.
Oh, thank you, man. We're all better for having you on and learning from you and your knowledge. So, everyone, thank you for listening to the podcast. Join us next time on the Meru Media, and take care.
पावन मुनि जन यमुना तीरे पावन मुनि जन यमुना तीरे गायती वनमाली गायती वनमाली